Alright, so today we are continuing with parallel lines and transversals. This is going to, again, go back to what we were talking about last time. Remember that the transversal is the line that crosses through to other lines. So again, looking at this picture, transversal is this guy. And then we learned all about different ways to classify our angles. Right, so we said our corresponding angles are on the same side of the transversal, but one's inside and one's outside. So it ends up being something where they're both on the same position relative to the transversal on, each line that crosses through that transversal line. When we have a transversal that passes through parallel lines, we get something like this. All of our corresponding angles are congruent. So that basically means that angle 1 has to match angle 3. Angle 2 has to match angle 4. 5 has to match 7, and 6 has to match 8. What does that mean for us? Well, it makes it really easy to figure out how big each angle is as long as we know at least one angle. Because if we think back to what we were talking about a few lessons back, we know that vertical angles are congruent. We know that linear pairs make 180. And so if all the angles start to match up, we know that all of the obtuse angles are going to be the same, and all of the acute angles are going to be the same. So, how does that work in practice? Well, let's look here. They tell us that measure of angle 5 is 72, so I'm going to mark that down. I know that when I see parallel lines, which is what these little two arrows mean, all my acute angles are the same. So what I'm going to do is just write down that all my acute angles are 72 degrees. And so when I mark up my picture, there's got to be 72 here. It's got to be 72 here. And 72 here. I don't know my obtuse angles yet, but I know all my linear pairs equal to 180. So if I'm not sure what to do, I know that I have to take 180 for the total, subtract out 72, and that gives me whatever's left over. So all my obtuse angles are 108. So I should be able to go through and mark up this picture, the 108s. So let's do this. Let's make this a little bit bigger so that we don't get confused with the 72 down here and the 108 up here. So at this point, I have figured out the value of any angle on that picture. So when it asks me to find angle 4, I just look at what's next to the 4. It's an acute angle, so it's 72 degrees. And tells me to find angle 2. Oh look, angle 2 is also acute, so it's got to be 72 degrees. And again, when we want to say the measure of an angle, put the little m, then the little angle sign, and we say which angle we are using. Alright, so for 1A, 1B, and 1C, you're going to erase, or maybe possibly draw the picture again, relabel it so that angle 8 is 105, and then follow the steps we just did, and hopefully you can figure out the remaining angles. Okay, so if you notice, this box is talking about the same sets of angles that we talked about last time. So alternate interior, consecutive interior, and alternate exterior. This is telling us which sets of angles match up and which sets of angles are supplementary. But if we think back to the example we just did, we really know just by looking at whether or not the angle is acute or obtuse, which ones match up. So you notice it tells me that 1 has to match 3. Well, they're both obtuse angles. And from what we talked about before, we know that that's going to end up being true. So if you forget exactly what alternate interior means, you can still figure out the value of the angle by just figuring out whether it's acute or obtuse, provided you've already figured out one angle in the picture. So we look at these streets. It's telling us that the measure of angle 1 is 118, and we need to find the measure of angle 2. So I'm going to mark 118. I know that angle 1 is obtuse. So my obtuse angles are all going to equal 118 degrees. I know that if I take 180 and subtract 118, it's going to give me 62. So that means all my acute angles have to equal 62. So look at the picture. It tells me to find the measure of angle 2. So all I have to do is figure out whether angle 2 is acute or obtuse, and that tells me which number to put. Again, if I look at this angle, looks like a big old angle, so that's going to be obtuse. All my obtuse angles are 118 because my lines are parallel, so that's my answer. So use that same picture to try to figure out 2A and 2B. And then we'll move on to the next example. Okay, so we're going to use the figure to figure out the indicated variable. So we're taking what we just did, but applying some algebra to it. So it's going to be a little bit more work, but the principle we're using is the same. So we notice they told us on part A, that measure 1 is 85. Okay, it's an acute angle. All my acute angles are 85. I don't know what my obtuse angles are yet, but I know it's supposed to add up with 85 to get 180. So if I subtract that out, it's going to give me 95. And then it tells me that angle 4 is 2x minus 17. Looks like angle 4 is obtuse. So my equation, 2x minus 17 is equal to 95. Again, because we said all of the obtuse angles have to be 95 degrees. They all have to match up. It's going to make our formula a bit easier. So I'm going to take this equation, solve for x. Right, so we're going to add the 17 to both sides. So 2x. I'll write that here. Has to equal 112. Then we'll divide by 2. So my x is going to equal 56. And I look back at the question. All it asked for was to find x. So that's my answer. All right, so let's fill in the next one. It says find the measure of angle 3, find y, given that the measure of angle 3 is 4y plus 30, and the measure of angle 7 is 7y plus 6. So all we're going to do is fill it in and solve. So angle 3 is 4y plus 30. Angle 7 is 7y plus 6. I notice they are both acute angles, so I can either make them equal to each other. Well, let's do this. We don't know that angle 1 is still 85 because this is a different problem. But they're both acute, so I know they're supposed to give me the same number. So I can say that 4y plus 30 is equal to 7y plus 6. Again, it's a new problem, so we can't assume that the information they gave us in the last problem is still correct unless they specifically told us that. So we're going to set up a new equation. We're going to solve for y. Right, so we can subtract the 4y on both sides. Subtract the 6. So that tells us that 3y has to equal 24. Divide by 3. So that tells us that y equals 8. And again, it just said to find y, so we are done. So here's a couple more practice examples for you. That's all for today. I will see you next time.